Welcome, sisters. Welcome to Tuesday. Today, something cool happened 1691 years ago. In the place known since 3000 years ago as Lygos, in the place that was known since 2500 years ago as Byzantium, and what was known since 1691 years ago as Constantinople, which is also what you know today as Istanbul. What happened all those years ago is that the emperor of the Roman Empire, Constantine, consecrated the city on the 11th of May with the name of Constantinople, literally Constantinopolis, the city of Constantine. Constantinopolis would grow to be the richest, largest, and most populated city for over 1,000 years and for pretty much the entirety of the Middle Ages. The acts of Constantine were so important that in the Hagia Sophia, the biggest now mosque of the city, you can still see the mosaic where Constantine is just showing up on the birth of baby Jesus and is gifting him, the entire fucking city. That's how badass he was. Now, for today, ladies, what's on the menu? What's on the menu for today is imagining a better world. Imagining a perfect meta where everyone is happy, or at least what you think would be perfect for your own tastes. What I mean by this is a question that you can have every time there is a new patch or a new expansion, looking into the future, looking into the unknown, and you question yourself, which specs do you want to see OP? Which specs do you want to see flavor of the month? What do you think could better your experience, for example, in Mythic Plus? Are you tired of seeing certain healers or tanks or DPS, or maybe are you tired of playing with them? Maybe you're a healer who dislikes the way a Vengeance Demon Hunter takes damage. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you're a tank who dislikes getting healed by a Discipline Priest, and you just want to see something different. So this is what we will be inspecting today. What would be a very good meta to see in 9.1 or maybe in 9.2 in a close enough future. Now, take in mind that there is absolutely no indication of any of this actually happening or Blizzard planning any of this. This is pure speculation with zero facts to back it up, or at least most of it. We are starting with the two smallest roles, the ones with the least amount of specs, the tanks and then the healers, because tanks of course only have 6 specs. So you're like, well, I mean, with 6 specs you would figure it wouldn't be too hard to sort of cycle them into meta, cycle them into OPness. Well, you would think, but it's not really what happened, because we do have a couple of specs that have never really gotten there, right? My answer for wanting to see new OP specs for 9.1 and the future is going to be Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin. The answer is simple. All the other 4 specs have cycled into OPness, have cycled into being meta in the last couple of expansions or so. In BFA, you had the start of the expansion where Vengeance Demon Hunter was very powerful, but it only lasted like a flash. In a couple of months, in less than a couple of months, it already dropped down, and the new king was Blood Death Knight. After Blood Death Knight, it was succeeded by Protection Warrior. After the Band-Aid buffs of Blizzard, a bunch more borrowed powers were being handed to Protection Warrior, and it became a disgusting Thunderclap machine, which was still very powerful nonetheless. So they had their power throughout BFA. All the while, Brewmaster was just sitting at the top since the start. In Mythic Plus, in raids, it was one of the strongest 2 tanks at any given time. It was either Blood Death Knight and Monk, or Protection Warrior and Monk, but Monk was always there. And this expansion has been not as oppressive, not as powerful. In fact, most of its popularity in raid can be attributed to the one who gives you the Monk debuff, the physical damage debuff pretty much in the raid. And the Mythic Plus is not the more popular either, so it has lost a little bit of its polish compared to BFA, but still had its moments of popularity, dating pretty recently, because it was BFA. Same can be said for Blood DK, same can be said for Protection Warrior, and same can be said for Vengeance Demon Hunter, who has had this entire tier of domination, which means the only 2 off are Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid. The more severe, we have to mention, the more severe state is the Guardian Druid. Guardian Druid's last time to shine was early to mid-Legion, basically, and that wasn't even in Mythic Plus, just in raids. And Protection Paladin has been in this weird limbo, where they have always hung around B tier. They have hung in mid tier. They were never the worst tank in Mythic Plus or in raids, but they were always this short. I am figuratively showing the index and the thumb being very close to each other, this short, from being better than the best tanks, but they never got to that point. So they were always in the middle. Even before the start of the expansion, I wished that this could have been the expansion where Protection Paladin was the one that finally wasn't just, oh yeah, it's good, man, just play it. Yeah, it's pretty powerful. But actually one of the better ones, and it wasn't. It's too squishy in Mythic Plus despite the damage it does, and in raids it's getting cucked by the tank specs that bring debuffs to a raid, which it doesn't, and neither does a Guardian Druid, which is also why I feel pretty sad and not very hopeful about this happening, because as long as tanks can bring so much importance to the debuffs in a raid, it's very unlikely for the two specs that basically bring nothing to the raid, Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin, it's pretty unlikely to see them being made part of a raid. As a matter of fact, if you're playing Guardian Druid, if you're playing Protection Paladin, or if you're wishing to be able to play them as a meta spec, you're probably better off hoping that a Windwalker Monk or a Mistweaver Monk or a Havoc Demon Hunter becomes super meta in 9.1. Because this would mean less of a need to keep a Brewmaster Monk or a Vengeance Demon Hunter tank in the raid because of the debuffs they can bring. So you're better off actually hoping for that. In which case, if you're hoping for Havoc Demon Hunter to be strong, I pray for your soul, because you are going to hell. Now, for the healers. What are my hopes for healers? What am I aiming at? Well, we can apply the same way of thinking to healers. Who has been OP for the longest time and who hasn't been OP for the longest time? The answer, if you look at this then, is obviously wishing for Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk to becoming flavor of the month and meta in the future patches of this game. Why? Well, obviously, Holy Paladin, Discipline Priest, and Restoration Shaman have terrorized the meta of raid encounters with their damage reduction. Now, this is not because I am a Shaman main. I have no bias here to tell you that the oppressiveness of Discipline and Holy Paladin is much worse than the one of a Shaman. Discipline Priest, with its absorbs, with its preventing other healers to even begin doing any healing because they are all absorbing it by themselves, is way more oppressive than what a Restoration Shaman has. And also, Holy Paladin being able to do that much damage as a healer spec, essentially cutting out all the other healers from Mythic Plus because of how much damage it can bring to a key, which is very important in Mythic Plus, as well as for the longest time basically being a manaless healer, a healer that was basically never running out of mana. You have experienced this as well, for sure, if you play PvP. They always had this advantage over other healers, which was way more oppressive than what a Shaman can annoy you with if you are another healer. As a matter of fact, a Shaman is actually helping you, because when you use Spirit Link Totem, the only unique thing a Shaman has, you're effectively taking away the HP from full HP players to redistribute it to players with lower HP, which means you're giving a chance to hot specs and AoE healing specs like Holy Priest and Restoration Druid to actually have much more healing done and zero overhealing, because Spirit Link Totem keeps readjusting the HP of all members, so you're actually getting help by a Shaman. On the other hand, no, Restoration Druid gets absolutely no sympathy here. I still hope it stays where it is. Restoration Druid was the strongest Mythic Plus healer spec for 2 expansions in a row. Only now they have tipped off a bit. In raid encounters, they have still always found their way. They were the only spec of the non-damage reduction healers to always comfortably make it in raids, and this was partially because of their popularity in Mythic Plus. I mentioned it's harder for a popular tank from Mythic Plus to make it in raids because they're gonna get cock-blocked by raid debuffs and raid buffs being needed, but for healers it's easier. You have way more slots for healers in a raid and in a raid roster as a whole than you have for tanks, so Restoration Druid always used to squeeze in BFA. They weren't stronger than the top 3, they weren't better, but they were still being used. So no need to see them OP again. I do have a need to see Mistweaver Monk and Holy Priest. Holy Priest has basically been overtaken by Discipline routinely since Mist of Pandaria, since the addition of Spirit Shell and the introduction of Atonement, the reworked Atonement, a little bit different than what it is today, but that's when Discipline Priest exploded. It already started seeing play in Cataclysm, but not to the levels of Mists. And then Mistweaver. Mistweaver was basically OP with its ridiculous revival and spread healing at the release of Mists, and that was it. After that, it just dropped off much more. So it's time to see them meta again. Now we are moving over to the DPS. Now this is of course a much more free area, because we have way more specs available, we have way more room to pick them, you are much less limited by things like buffs and debuffs that you can bring, because the slots for a DPS role are much bigger. Something like, 5 to 8 slots for the melee, something more like 8 to 10, 8 to 11 for your ranged DPS, so you have way more room. And then of course, yes, there are way more specs. 11 for ranged, 13 for melee. And what about the melee DPS? So because DPS are often gated by just how much damage they can do, so one buff, one legendary, one passive added can swing greatly their effectiveness, way more so than tanks and healers, which are often gated more by their mechanics, the way they work. DPS can very often happen that between one tier and the next, boom, one spec out of nowhere becomes meta. So they have cycled in their power over time. Plenty of them have seen their spotlight over time. So when you look at melee, I'm not gonna go for the easy answer, the easy cop-out answer, because even me, as a dreamer, I know I would be wasting everyone's time if I said survival. Survival is a doomed endeavor, just don't even bother bringing it up. So what I'm going to be saying instead is Subtlety Rogue and Frost Death Knight. I had to think whether or not I wanted to see Frost Death Knight or Feral Druid or Ret Paladin. Eventually, Retribution Paladin is already doing fine right now, so it's not that bad. And Feral Druid, I'm kind of in the same level of a Survival Hunter. It's just not gonna be popular enough with the player base anyways. I wanted to go for something a little bit more feasible. Subtlety Rogue, as I mentioned already, is pretty enjoyable to play, and I consider Outlaw awful to play, and Assassination also pretty boring to play, so at least I want to give Rogues something fun to play. And also because Subtlety has had it pretty tough recently. They have grown to scale and to be pretty strong by the end of Legion. They had a pretty rough start of Legion, but by the end they were doing pretty well. But then, in BFA, a disaster. At the start of Shadowlands, a disaster. Assassination, but more importantly, Outlaw, have had way too much of a room for oppressiveness, particularly Outlaw. So it's time to end this. I want to see Subtlety being powerful again. For the other melee spec that I picked was Frost DK. Why Frost DK? I just think Frost DK is cooler and more entertaining than Unholy Death Knight. They have a similar playstyle. I just enjoy the way Frost plays more than Unholy. It wouldn't be too bad for DK players. At least you just have to change specs. You wouldn't even have to reroll to a different class. And also because when you look at the OP-ness of the spec, it's not that Frost Death Knight has gotten much of any highlight recently. And with recently, we are talking years. So it would be cool to see them rise up for a little bit. When it comes to range DPS are pretty question mark, because just in the last couple of expansions, we have seen Affliction being meta and flavor of the month. We have seen Destruction, we have seen Fire, and then Frost. We've also seen Arcane. This was a little bit further back in Legion. We have seen Balanced Druid, of course. We have seen Shadow Priest at multiple parts of the last expansions. We have seen both Beast Mastery and Marksmanship Hunter being very popular and very oppressive at different parts of the expansion. The only ones who we have seen being held back a little bit more have been Elemental Shaman and Demonology Warlock. They haven't really seen as much flavor of the month-ness. Now, this might be a recurring thought, but you might be saying, hey, now, come on, you're a shaman, and after restoration, now it's also elemental. Well, I just mentioned to you all of the other specs that have cycled through OP-ness over time. Can you really tell me elemental has gotten the same fair share of spotlight as all of the other specs have in the past? There is literally no recourse you can have for Hunter. You have had a disgusting state of Beast Mastery Hunter, the last tier of Nyalotha, and a disgusting state of Marksmanship before they got nerfed in this first tier. I won't even mention Fire Mage because only insults would come out of my mouth. Frost Mage has gotten its fair share of popularity. Balanced Druid also is better to not mention anything about the spec. Affliction is the same, Destruction and the end of BFA, same thing, as well as Shadow Priest. So they have all gotten to absolutely disgusting level of brokenness over the last few tiers. The only ones who haven't, at any point, as I mentioned, are Demonology and Elemental. That's just facts. I'm just going to throw in Arcane Mage, okay? Just because it is true that Arcane Mage has gotten to some points, but it was more back into Legion, and most of that it was just meme bursts for short fights. So fine. Elemental, Demonology, and Arcane are the specs that should grow to the top. Elemental is already in a pretty healthy state in both popularity and damage. They have gotten buffed a few weeks ago. Their overall damage has gotten higher, so more people are seeing them as doing better, even though they were doing just fine before. now because of their AoE buffs. Their overall damage is higher in Mythic Plus, it's higher in the padding fights, it shows up as higher, so they don't even need that much of a push in the next tier. For Demonology and for Arcane, it's a little bit different. Demonology is getting buffed, and has been getting buffed for a while, and Affliction has gotten nerfed, so we are at the very least on the same track. I did point out to you in my fun factor that Demonology is a pretty divisive type of spec because of the way it plays, which is also why I wouldn't mind at all to see Demonology. Let's just say that if I had to make a ranking of the specs I do want to see becoming meta, then Demonology would be the first. And fine, Arcane would be the second. And lastly, Elemental, since Elemental is already in a pretty good spot. Now, this is mostly just for giving everyone the same opportunities. I still think Arcane is a terrible spec. I wouldn't want, in a normal situation, I wouldn't want to hope and to wish onto someone to play Arcane Mage for fun. That's not something anyone should do. But it is true, they haven't been as popular and as powerful as other specs. They haven't been given their rightful turn in this game, so they should get their own. Hopefully, if it came with some redesign, changing a little bit how the spec plays and making it a little bit more than just a 3-button mashing, it would be cooler, okay? Maybe if you can not spend 50% of your time channeling arcane missiles, it would be more entertaining. But for the sake of power, I think it's good to not have Fire Mage continue this disgusting path they have now set up upon like 3 tiers ago in Eternal Palace, so it's something that is needed. So these will be my picks for the next patch. Protection, Paladin and Guardian Druid for tanks, Holy Priest and Mistweaver Monk for healers, and Subtlety and Frost Decay for melee DPS, Arcane and Demonology and Elemental for ranged. Now, when I say I want to see the specs being meta and flavor of the month and being played, does it mean I want to see the current ones being weak? Basically, do I want to see the current ones being deleted from the game? When it comes to tanks, it is very likely going to be something that is not up for debate, in the sense that if you become flavor of the month as a tank, remember you only have 2 slots in the raid. So usually it just ends up happening this way. It's much less likely to see all of the tank specs living happy, in harmony, holding hands. It can happen very often with DPS, you can have multitudes of them being fine and healthy and playable, but when it comes to tanks, it's too cutthroat. There is just not enough spots for tanks to be like this, to be represented like this. So it's much more likely that if you get 2 new specs being meta, the previous tank specs are just going to die out slowly over time. They will find less and less space. When it comes to healers, it's not as oppressive. It's still not that good, but there are generally 4 spots for healers in raids. A roster of healers, a normal roster of healers is going to have at least 6 players, and the role itself has 6 different specs, so technically you do have the chance to rotate around and to always make the popular healers or the less popular healers switch. So going from Discipline, Restoration Shaman and Holy Paladin to Holy Priest and Mistweaver could still have some room for the least popular specs to be played, much more so than tanking, of course. And then when it comes to DPS is where this matters the least. Honestly, if Fire Mage died out in favor of Arcane, there would be no different. All of the current Fire Mage players would just re-roll to Arcane, except for the 5% hardcore fans, which are currently the 5% hardcore Arcane Mage fans that are still playing Arcane. The same would be, for example, for Outlaw Rogue. You have the 5% hardcore Subtlety Rogue fans playing Subtlety, and everyone right now is playing Outlaw or Assassination. If Subtlety would become the meta, then you would have the opposite. The only difference that we could see is something I already mentioned, which is Demonology Warlock. Because of the way it plays differently, because of the way the damage is shifted onto pets, and it's a little bit harder for certain people to enjoy that playstyle, some more players would be more stubborn and remain Affliction or remain Destruction over going Demonology. But for most of the other specs, it wouldn't be too big of an issue. For Fire Mage to die, for Affliction to die, these players would just vacate their spec and move to the other one in their class. The only difference would be for Balanced Druid and Shadow Priest, because they do not have a backup plan. They have no alternative, so if their spec were to become weak, they would either have to accept being taken less in Mythic Plus and being the type of DPS that is being picked in the last 2 to 3 options when filling a raid, after you slot in all the flavor of the month all the buffs and debuffs, etc., etc. You have 2 to 3 roles left. That would be their role, and in Mythic Plus they would take the role of the hipster spec, or otherwise they have to reroll, which is unfortunate, but it's the nature of hybrid specs. You have seen this every time, every expansion to these type of classes. It always happens, so you have to deal with it. So with this we are done. These were my picks for the specs I want to see being powerful and represented in 9.1. Eventually, we'll go over this and see how many of these are going to be correct at the release of the patch or a few weeks into the patch. I can tell you already, I have close to 0 hope for the tanks to becoming this popular, unless one of the other specs of Monk and Demon Hunter become popular. I also have 0 hopes for Mystery Monk on becoming meta, and slightly more for Holy Priest. Actually, as I said, I am drinking the Holy Priest Kool-Aid, so I do believe in them. And when it comes to DPS, I also have 0 hopes for Demonology and very little for Arcane. I am cautiously confident on Elemental Shaman becoming more popular and powerful. I am not particularly hopeful for Frost Death Knight. I saw the nerfs to Unholy. I thought Frost was going to get the upsy downy and be the one to go up in terms of buffs, but so far they haven't really gotten much of anything. And for Subtlety, just about the same. I was confident in Subtlety. I did think they were gonna eventually get some buffs. Unfortunately, the spotlight to 9.0.5 was taken by Assassination, and now so far in 9.1 they haven't really gotten much of anything either, so I'm a little bit antsy on this hopefulness to Subtlety as well. Let me guys know your picks for what do you want to see being meta in 9.1 for the 3 different roles. No, stop. Anyone who was about to type, actually I am fine with Vengeance, and now that I think about it, even with Fire Mage. Around the corner to the left, that is the door out of this channel, please leave. Okay, thank you guys for watching this video. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. If you don't, I wish upon you the player base of Survival Hunter. We will see each other very likely tomorrow, and in the meantime, I swear, by the way, I'm not being paid by a lobby to bully Survival Hunter. I just think it's fun.